to be feared. And as with Maxentius, the incoming Augustus is often blamed for Constantine getting frozen out of the Tetrarchy. But again, it could have just as easily have been Diocletian wanting to table the idea of blood succession forever. But whatever Diocletian's wishes, it did not mean that anyone was going to take any of this lying down. The interests of the western half of the original Tetrarchy, for whatever reason, had just been blatantly ignored. If Diocletian and Galerius didn't think that was going to pose problems for them down the road, then they were in for a rude awakening. Initially, however, there was little the two snubbed princes could do. Constantine was particularly helpless because the court that had been Diocletian's, the one he was presently attached to, was now controlled by Galerius, meaning that the new Augustus held the life of Constantine in his hands. Not only would this stifle whatever seditious ambitions Constantine might be dreaming up, but it would also serve as a convenient check on Constantius's activities. The new Augustus of the West fully understood this fact, and right away he began sending Galerius letters asking that Constantine be released, but Galerius ignored him. Constantine, meanwhile, petitioned the Eastern Augustus personally, asking, begging, demanding, imploring that he be allowed to go west and serve with his father. Legend has it that finally, in the midst of a drinking bout, a fed-up Galerius finally acquiesced and told Constantine he could go do whatever he wanted. Hardly pausing to pack, Constantine allegedly headed west that very night, crippling the horses at each post he passed along the way, convinced that as soon as Galerius sobered up, he would realize the mistake he had made and come after the fleeing Constantine. This exciting tale is probably hyperbole, but at its core lay the key truth that Constantine was allowed to leave and that Galerius had blundered in allowing him to leave. All in all, it probably wasn't so bad for Galerius that people thought he was drunk when he made the decision. Better that than for people to think that he had been sober. Whatever the real story, Constantine, now in his early 30s, arrived in Boulogne in the summer of 305, where his father was preparing for a return trip to Britain. Together for the first time, really, a father and son made their way across the English Channel and waged a brief campaign against the Picts, who lived north of Hadrian's Wall. The fighting went well enough for the Romans that in January of 306, Constantius again took the title Britannicus Maximus. But in the background of all this, his ascension to full Augustus, his reunion with his son, his war with the Picts, was the fact that Constantius was a very sick man. Probably the worst thing that could happen to the fragile Tetrarchy at that point was for an unpredictable illness or accident to take out one of the members before the new team could solidify. But unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. In July of 306, while working up plans for a second campaign against the Picts in York, Constantius suddenly died, leaving a big gaping hole where a solid leg of the Tetrarchic stool had once stood. The life and career of Constantius is often lost in the confusing shuffle of the Tetrarchy, and when it's not busy being lost, it's busy being overshadowed by the sheer giganticness of his son. But Constantius led a good and noble life, and it ought to be remembered. He brought Britain back into the empire, he kept the German tribes at bay, he ruled effectively over his territory, and though we don't have polls to confirm it, I would reckon that he was probably the most personally popular of all the Tetrarchs. It doesn't seem fair, then, that he is often listed as, quote, emperor, merely for the years 305 to 306, making it look to a casual observer like he was just another transient and forgettable soldier emperor. I think we should give him full credit for his whole imperial career, and say that Constantius was about 56 years old when he died, and that he helped rule the empire, well and good, for just over 13 years. As is often the case, what happened in the aftermath of Constantius's death has been processed through enough propaganda and counter-propaganda that it's nearly impossible to separate truth from fiction. In the official version, that is, Constantine's version, wanted his fathers to claim Constantine Augustus when he was dead, and that when he died, that's exactly what they did. Other versions say that Constantius took no part in the decision to elevate Constantine, and that the army did it on its own, while still others state flatly that Constantine ambitiously engineered it all himself once his father was out of the way. So, again, it's hard to tell what the exact cause and effect was, but the end result was that the troops stationed in York, along with the king of the Alemanni and his men who were present, went ahead and proclaimed Constantine Augustus in July 306 AD. News spread quickly across the west, and in no time, Constantine's claim was recognized throughout Britain and Gaul. Now I know what you're thinking, and yes, you heard that right. The troops went ahead and named him Augustus, not Caesar. So not only was Constantine being unilaterally inserted into the Imperial College, but he was being inserted at the top of the heap. This, as you can imagine, did not go over well with Galerius, his deputy Maximinus Daia, nor Severus, the man who was in line to actually become Augustus should Constantius die. It also did not go over too well with Maxentius, who was suddenly in danger of being left behind completely in the now fast-paced world of the post-Diocletian Tetrarchy. Constantine sent a letter to Galerius informing the Augustus of the East what had happened, swearing that none of this had been his doing, that his troops had nearly forced him at spear point to become their leader, so what was he supposed to do? Galerius flew into a rage at this upstart's presumption, not believing for a second that Constantine was somehow an innocent third party in all this. But it was also an impotent rage. There was, maddeningly enough, little reason to doubt that the legions of the West, along with the allied German auxiliaries, were indeed loyal to the son of Constantius. Galerius could fume all he wanted, but he understood that at this point, only a full-scale civil war would be able to dislodge Constantine if the young pretender chose to fight for his claim, and that it would be a civil war whose outcome would not at all be certain. So after he calmed down, Galerius considered the realities of the situation, and decided to bargain with Constantine instead of fighting with him. He sent back a message saying that Constantine's entrance into the Tetrarchy would be accepted, but that it would not be as an Augustus. Instead, Severus would properly receive the promotion that was coming to him, and Constantine would be ratified as the new Caesar of the West. Knowing that his position was strong, but not absolutely so, Constantine accepted the deal. He was playing a long game, and playing it for keeps. The first thing he needed was legitimacy, and that is exactly what Galerius was offering. Everything else would come in its own due time. Meanwhile, down in Rome, Maxentius stewed unhappily over this development. It was one thing for both he and Constantine to be left out of the Tetrarchy, but with Constantine now in, why was Maxentius still out? It was a question that began to be asked not just within Maxentius's inner circle, but also within the Senate of Rome. Though their reasons for talking about it were a bit different from Maxentius's. Maxentius was reeling from a personal slight. The Senate, on the other hand, was looking for someone to carry them back to relevance. This disgruntled prince in their midst seemed like the perfect guy. So they stoked his resentment, and wondered along with him why noble Maxentius was being treated like a dog, why they were all now slaves to this Severus, who nobody knew and who nobody really liked. How much better would it be if noble Maxentius combined his power with that of mighty Rome itself? Together, they could seize what was rightfully theirs. By the autumn of 306, Rome was practically brimming over with revolutionary angst, and when Severus announced a new round of taxes, remember, that the Italians were not at all used to dealing with, the city exploded. Adding to this outrage, Severus also announced in October that the already much diminished Praetorian Guard was about to be officially abolished. At this, officers of the guard went to Maxentius and hailed him as their emperor, asking him to put a stop to the rampant injustices of the tyrant Severus. Maxentius was more than ready to accept the offer. Working with the Roman nobility, he quickly secured the loyalty of southern Italy, Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and most of the West African provinces. But unlike his counterpart to the north, Maxentius did not presume to have himself proclaimed either Augustus or Caesar, and instead decided the least antagonistic course of action would be for him to wait for Galerius, now unequivocally the senior emperor, to recognize his claim to power. But whatever leaps of rationalization Galerius had been able to make when he recognized Constantine, he was unable to make for Maxentius. At least in Constantine's case, one of the 4 emperors had died, and a spot was vacant. But at present, there was no vacancy in the Tetrarchy, and so there was no room for Maxentius. Plus, Galerius had acquiesced to one pretender already. If he acquiesced to another, then every general in the empire would get it into its head that all you had to do was demand a promotion, and that pushover Galerius would then be happy to grant your request. So, no dice for Maxentius. Instead, Galerius ordered Severus to crush him. In early 307, Severus gathered up his army and marched on Rome, fully intending to return to Milan with the young man's head on a spike. But as it turned out, Maxentius was no pushover, and capturing Rome no easy task. This was the first real test of the Aurelian walls, and they performed splendidly. Severus could make no headway with ease. On top of that, the troops Severus led had just spent the last 20-odd years serving Maximian, and their true loyalties were not hard to deduce, especially when they began to desert in droves to Maxentius' banner. It was at this point that Maximian, living a comfortable retirement down in southern Italy, could contain himself no longer. Envoys from the Senate, from the Praetorian Guard, and from his own son had already asked him to come out of retirement, but he had so far refused to break his oath to Diocletian that he was done with politics. But with Severus besieging Rome, and his old troops defecting to Maxentius, Maximian could stay on the sidelines no longer. He left his villa and headed north. When word reached the capital that Maximian was on his way, Severus finally recognized that his position was hopeless. He withdrew with the troops he had left and made for Ravenna, where he planned to regroup. When Maximian entered Rome, he was happily embraced by his son and the aristocracy, who both saw the usefulness of having the ex-Augustus on their side. The old man's first task would be to lead the army north to capture Severus and force him to abdicate, which would open the necessary spot in the Tetrarchy for Galerius to go ahead and insert Maxentius. This, Maximian was able to pull off with ease. Severus really was an outsider in Italy. He had no friends and no stable base of power. When Maximian arrived in Ravenna, it was just a matter of time before the city was betrayed into his hands. So when Maximian got word to Severus that if the Western Augustus surrendered himself peacefully, that he would be allowed to live, Severus reluctantly turned himself over, seeing no other way out. His mission accomplished, however, Maximian revealed to the world that it was now dealing with a far less stable